Hello, this is TelecomTV. We are here at the SDN World Congress 2016 at the Hague in the Netherlands. I'm talking with an old friend and an old friend of TelecomTV, Andrew Coward, who is the VP of Strategy at Brocade. Andrew, good to see you.
Martin, good to see you.
Jet lagged and straight in from sunny California into really quite cold Netherlands. It's chilly, isn't it?
It's not what I'm used to.
Well, you're English, come on.
I've forgotten it all.
Okay. I'd like to begin by asking you about IoT as a generalization. There's a tremendous amount of hype and bugle oil being expended on IoT at the moment. It's hard to, pick the wheat from the chaff. What do you see as being most important about it? Off camera, we were talking about the millions, if not billions, of devices that are forecast to be joined together soon. Where's that going to take us? What are the problems?
Yeah, well, I think people think that this is going to happen in the future, but the reality is it's already happened, and there are already millions of devices. The problem with those devices, whether they're on Wi-Fi or on LTE or 2G, is they're not necessarily managed and they're not necessarily orchestrated. So in recent times, we've seen them being used as to generate botnets and attack networks. Why? Because they're not managed and they're not orchestrated. So I think the big challenge as we think about the next billion and the billion after that is how we drive to the automation processes that need to get put in place to make them all work securely and in a way that doesn't completely flood the network or kind of change the business model around how the network works. So what that means, for example, is the difference between having a mobile phone on a network and having an IoT device on the network can be huge. An IoT device comes in many forms, right? So it could be a video camera that's generating a high-definition video stream, huge impact on the network, or it could be something that just transmits once a month. So we've got this very broad generalization around what IoT may or may not be. For each of those things, then, the network needs to be tuned specifically for that application and that service. And that's not what's happening today. So the shift is really essentially how is the mobile network going to deal with video feeds if that's what they're going to do? How is it going to deal with these once-a-month check-ins? And then the network needs to scale according to those dimensions. So when we at Brocade think about software and how we support that, software networking, how we support that, it's the dimensions of we want to scale bandwidth on one hand, or we want to scale control on the other. And we need to be able to do those very dynamically, whereas today what happens is that the assumption is everything's a smartphone.
Indeed.
So that's really the shift that needs to happen.
Interesting. Something you don't hear very much about as you say, in all the hype and how great it's going to be. But there's a lot to be done. Is it starting now? Are people, you obviously at Brocade are aware of this, you just talked about it, but is that being taken up and people are beginning to be aware of the great problems that could come if this isn't done properly?
I think we're in a learning process. I think last year was about learning what happens in a lab. And this year has been about what happens in practice.
Right, which can be very, very different.
Which is different.
Yeah.
And for us, I think, maybe somewhat naively 4 or 5 years ago, we started out with the premise of, we'll replace this piece of hardware with this piece of software networking. And then the service providers, enterprises, they'll figure out what to do with it and it'll be good. That turned out not to be the case. And perhaps not surprisingly now, and everybody thinks that. But what we ended up with was this journey where it went around the gamut from the automation processes that have to be put in place, the virtualization technologies that have to be put in place, and then the culture shift that comes with that. So we've ended up, for example, standing up DevOps, NetOps teams to help our customers go through this transition. One of the things that we've noticed our customers are very focused on as they make this cultural transition themselves is they want to be part of the process. And that sounds obvious, but a lot of the times, certainly in the old days of OSS and BSS and all the support systems, it was done for them and it was done in a proprietary way. And so we're kind of shifting from this do it all for me and I'll just send you a really big check to I need to be at each step in the process so I can shift my culture with the vendors, with the industry. And kind of with that is the separation of services that at each layer in this, and that's it's a very different world that we or anybody else is used to. I have this strange thing to say to customers, which is, if you do this right, we're replaceable. Well, what do you mean? Well, think about how hard it is to replace a product today. So you may love Brocade, but to make that transition from your existing vendor to Brocade can be very hard because of all the integration, all the services and everything else that's been built on that over the last decade. What should happen is that the products should work in this abstracted, automated framework where I can put my product in today, and if you don't like me, you don't like my technology, it should be replaceable. And that only works if the right orchestration layers are in place and the right abstraction layers are in place. So we've had to spend our time on working with those abstraction layers. So things like our commitment to Open Daylight, for example, has been a way of abstracting what we do. And then the work more recently we've done with network management partners, be they Amdocs or Netcracker or Rift.io and all of the plethora of vendors that are out there. That's critical for us to be able to see our solutions managed end to end. So that's what we've learned, and that's the work that's taken place as we've moved from the lab into live deployments.
Into reality. What about the money? Not necessarily the money as far as Brocade is concerned, but the money in general. What are the new business models? Are you observing them emerging, and the services and that sort of thing will enable CSPs to generate return on investment on network transformation? Does it exist now? Is it there?
Well, again, this is one of the learned or missing components along the way. I think a lot of people thought that NFV was an internal transformation. It was a transformation to save money, a transformation to become more agile. But when it's turned to, well, what do customers want? They need to be able to make a decision to move from the old platform to the new platform. What does that really mean? And why would they make that transition? I mean, in Europe, we still have, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of people using ISDN, for example, which nobody talks about today. Because there was no compelling reason to make the shift. So the compelling reasons that are shaking out, and there's really two that we see as kind of transformational. One is this shift to virtual CPE. And the reason that's interesting, because it doesn't on acronym basis alone, but the idea of being able to take 4 or 5 boxes that are in the enterprise today, and these things seem to breed and they get more and more over time, right? So I need a router, I need a firewall, I need a VPN gateway, I need a WAN acceleration product, I need collapsing all of those things into one and allowing them to be deployed and managed as software components, not hardware components. That's very compelling. If you're a retail chain or a bank and you suddenly need to deploy a new security solution, you shouldn't have to ship new hardware to do that. It should just be a software update you push out. And with all the security attacks we've seen over the last couple of years on banks, on retailers and so on, then that becomes a driving factor. The second, which has really started out as an arbitrage play, has been the SD-WAN. And so I'd argue SD-WAN in its first iterations has actually been kind of anti-carrier to the extent that you buy a solution that's completely separate from the carrier, it sits on top as an overlay, and for it to really work today, you need to buy services from 2 or 3 different carriers, and it then picks which is the optimal solution with the optimal path for traffic. What that does is it says, I don't need MPLS anymore. So instead of paying 2,000 euros or $2,000, whatever it is a month, I'm now paying $200. And so that was a straight arbitrage play. Now the carriers are beginning to co-opt that and saying, well, what if we bring MPLS into the mix? What if we bring our price points down? What if we give this guarantee of service for this higher bandwidth play? So we're beginning to see this kind of convergence of things that have real value to customers starting to play out. And it's our belief that SD-WAN and virtual CPE come together, because otherwise SD-WAN just becomes yet another box to put in the chain of things that play out. So with those two things coming together, some very compelling service offerings that really bite into the business value that the service providers can deliver.
Interesting stuff. Hopefully this will be equally interesting. I find this fascinating. It's a chicken and egg question. We hear an awful lot about deployment of NFV, the commercialisation of NFV, but we don't hear a great deal about the operationalisation, if I can say that, of NFV. Which comes first? The commercialisation or operationalisation of it?
You're going to make me say those words.
I am. You try it.
So it comes back to, well, what is the service going to look like? And that, I believe, is a commercialisation discussion at the outset. why am I deploying this, what business value, and so on. So that has to be built first. But it has to be built off a framework of understanding what the underlying cost components are. So, for example, the cost of this box, that it is still hardware we're talking about, that gets deployed. Is it Atom-based? Is it Xeon-D based? Is it ARM-based? What cost point is that going to come in at? Because that's going to affect everything else. And the difference between a customer spending $500 and $1,000 actually comes down to software performance. So we spend a lot of time getting the commercialization pieces right, which is how can you get the cost points of this economically at the right place for the services you need to deliver. And it's not always true that all the software vendors who are coming into this, or the hardware vendors that are coming into this, are willing to make the concessions. So, for example, we've seen the price of the software be the same price as the hardware from vendors. That doesn't work. Another example, if you think about it, we want resiliency in these solutions. So many times you want to deploy 2 of these products and not 1. And certainly if you're shipping boxes globally and you're in an oil field in Nigeria, you don't have a backup plan if box number 1 fails, so there has to be 2 boxes.
Yeah.
But then historically, you go back to the 5 boxes there, you wouldn't have put 10 boxes in place.
True.
But now with the software licensing models done right, you can effectively have those 10 boxes there. They're just software licenses that run as and when needed to be executed. So that calls for a change of how vendors think about how they commercialize those things. So once you've got that sorted and you understand how that's going to play out, then you into the operationalization.
You said it. Well done.
Struggle with that. And with that, it's the service chaining pieces and the business logic and so on. And again, that comes to the orchestration vendors that are starting to really become kingmakers in a way of how on which service operators succeed and which vendors succeed by how they're bound into those things. And then, again, going back to this NetOps, DevOps world that plays into it, and the benefits of this operationalization model, once you get it right, say it right, is that making tweaks to the service because something doesn't work. So commercialization didn't work because this piece was too expensive or this piece was too slow or didn't work. These things should be replaceable. So going right to the point of replaceability, if one element doesn't work, for whatever reason, it should be replaceable through this service chain. And that if the abstraction and the business logic is done correctly, then it enables that. Because today we've seen this paradox that people automated. In fact, the cloud service providers probably automated early and first. And they found themselves actually locked in and slower than ever because they were operationalizing and automating against a specific piece of hardware, specific piece of software. And what then meant was that if something simple happened, like they just upgraded the software from one version to another, the 200 scripts they wrote didn't work anymore. And so they were therefore slowed down in their innovation cycle and not accelerated. And that was something that we learned in this abstraction play that needs to come in the middle of this to say, I shouldn't care, my script shouldn't care about the version of operating system that's running, it shouldn't care about what vendor it even is, it should just work the same way. And that's really why the operationalization models need to reflect the separation of services that play out with this.
Interesting stuff and a different take on things. And you said operationalization 3 times.
I did, just about.
Just about. Well done. Again, as usual. Andrew Coward, thanks very much.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, Martin.